Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Improve Your Pricing Strategy with Revenue Management. Thanks so much for coming, I really appreciate it. I know your time is very valuable, so we'll try and make the best use of it and provide some value for you. But first, a little about me. My name is Gavin Wadsworth, and I am a hospitality researcher and content writer at ResNexus with a degree in digital cinema. Today's topic of revenue management is something I've been researching a lot lately, so I'm very excited to share it with you. One interesting thing about me that not a lot of people know is that I worked on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska when I was a teen. That meant I was on this fishing boat for essentially 3 months straight at a time, with not a lot to do when we weren't catching salmon. I always point to this as my first real character building experience. I love Alaska, and I'd love an excuse to go visit again sometime. It's definitely kindled a desire to visit new places and see the world. So, what is revenue management? Essentially, revenue management is the application of consumer analytics to maximize profits by selling the right product to the right customer at the right time for the right price. In other words, revenue management means having a cohesive strategy by understanding your customers, their buying habits, their preferences, and what they're willing to spend based on all of those factors. If revenue management is the strategy behind selling and pricing your inventory, then having no strategy at all is the worst revenue management you can do. Flat rate pricing is a big indicator that a business has no revenue management strategy. Flat rate pricing means every product has the same price regardless of supply and demand, customer insights, the quantity that are purchased, and so on. The bottom line is, if you're using flat rate pricing, you're leaving money on the table. Imagine if airlines did flat rate pricing. Every flight is $200, no matter where you're going, when you bought the ticket, what class of seat you pay for, time of arrival, and so on. Sure, it'd be pretty convenient to always know how much a flight costs, and it would certainly make some people's jobs a lot easier in the airline. But just imagine how much revenue they'd be missing out on. First-class flights to Hawaii would sell out faster than you can blink, while multiple layover flights to Nowheresville would be virtually passengerless. So why should you use revenue management? In short, it's good for your business, it's good for your guests, and it's just good economics. Revenue management is beneficial for any business, and hospitality is no exception. It's especially important for hospitality, in fact. In this industry, your product is perishable, meaning that if you don't sell a room night, you won't ever have another chance to sell that room night. Therefore, you'd be best served by having a powerful strategy in place to price your available rooms or units to make sure you're making the most of them. Plus, most businesses in this industry have high fixed costs for maintaining the property. Things like employee salaries, cost of utilities, and marketing expenses are all consistent regardless of whether a room or unit is occupied. Coming at this from the other direction are external factors like inflation and gas prices. Inflation rates this year have been hovering around the 8% mark and steadily rising. The money you're earning doesn't have as much buying power as it used to, and the trend continues to rise. In a world where inflation is a given reality every year, having a consistent revenue stream isn't enough to keep pace. You need to be improving your revenue year over year just to match inflation. Worldwide, gas prices in 2022 are higher than they've ever been. Global conflicts, supply chain issues, and many other factors are contributing to this. It's an expensive world out there, and with the prices of goods and services only going up, staying afloat is more difficult than ever. But you can compensate for a more expensive world by being clever with your pricing strategy. Revenue management is also good for your guests. Remember, revenue management isn't just increasing prices, it can also mean lowering them. It's all about matching the price to the demand. And even if prices are being raised, that can actually also be beneficial to the customer. It seems counterintuitive, but let's get into it. So earlier I mentioned that airline example. Imagine being one of those people trying to book a flight to see your family, but all the flights are booked out months in advance. Sure, it's great for the people who were able to get seats at a great price, but you might have been willing to pay more than them for one of those seats. When a business doesn't price their goods at the cost people are willing to pay for them, it puts things out of balance. If a product or service has enough value for a customer to justify the price, they'll pay it. By now, it should be clear that revenue management benefits both your business and the guests, so it should come as no surprise that it benefits the industry as well. When one business starts pricing their rooms to match supply and demand and customer habits, their performance will improve. They'll be able to afford better renovations, more staffing hours, and premium service. In order to stay competitive, the other businesses in the area will have to follow suit. The end result is a market rich with quality products at competitive prices. This enriches your community and makes it a more coveted travel destination. Those businesses that fail to price appropriately with revenue management won't thrive like those that do, and may find themselves quickly outpaced. All these factors mean you have to price appropriately. It's a competitive world, and having a powerful pricing strategy can help you succeed. By using the tools available to you, you can improve your revenue in a variety of ways. The more you understand about the market and what travelers are looking for, the better you'll be able to make predictions and adjust your pricing strategy. So it's really in your best interest to learn all you can. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy, although there are a few simple steps you can take to avoid just having flat rate pricing. This is an ongoing process that takes creative thinking, experimentation, and measurement. Crunching numbers and stats might not be the reason you got into the hospitality industry, but it's important nonetheless, and it can really benefit your business. Some ResNexus properties have 5 to 10% of their total revenue coming directly from yield management alone, and that's just one part of a revenue management strategy. So there are a few misconceptions floating around about whether using revenue management is being greedy or malicious. But if you stop to think about it for a minute, it's kind of a strange objection. After all, the price of most anything you purchase is set the way it is as a result of revenue management. Buy one, get one free? That's revenue management. Seasonal discount? That's revenue management. Buying a plane ticket to Hawaii rather than Nowheresville and it's more expensive? That's revenue management. I mentioned gas prices earlier. Those prices don't just go up and down arbitrarily. It's in response to supply and demand. Those prices are set by revenue management. They change so regularly that they have to be displayed on electronic signs, and people have accepted it. There's also an idea that your customers will somehow get together, compare notes, and start colluding in order to figure out that you're changing your rates, and then call you out on it as if you've done something wrong. First of all, it's not wrong. It's reacting to the supply and demand of the market in order to run a profitable business. Second of all, how many times has anyone actually done this? Has a stranger ever approached you during a trip to interrogate you about how much you paid for your room? Probably not. That would be a strangely rude thing to do. Even family members who are able to see a variation in pricing across different reservations usually don't think twice about it. And if you are ever asked directly about why your rates aren't consistent, there's no need to act shameful or guilty or anything. It's easy to honestly say, yes, our pricing model is a result of different factors, so it won't always look the same. I apologize for causing any confusion. Or to put it more simply, yeah, our pricing depends on how early you book, or whether you book directly with us. These interactions rarely happen, and people who get upset about small fluctuations in price are typically outliers. And if you have a repeat guest asking about the change in rates, then there's nothing stopping you from rewarding their loyalty with a discount. And this can turn an otherwise negative interaction into a positive experience. It can help reinforce that loyalty for the future. If you're the kind of property that reaches 100% occupancy pretty quickly, consider how many people you have to turn away because you're at capacity, and how many of those would be high-paying guests who are willing to spend a bit more due to the high demand. If there's lots of demand, but no way for them to cash in on it, it's hard to know just how many people will be disappointed. Think also about Disneyland and their fast passes. People pay through the nose just to go to Disneyland, and then pay an arm and a leg for these fast passes that let them get on the rides faster than anyone else. They pay for it because it's worth it to them. Remember, there's a market for people who still want a product even at a steeper price. So let's get into it. When we talk about revenue management, there are really three main categories we talk about: variable pricing, dynamic pricing, and yield management. These terms have different definitions depending on the industry and who you're talking to, but this distinction helps keep us organized so we know what we're talking about. So let's start with variable pricing. Variable pricing is the practice of adjusting your rates based on factors that add value to the room or unit. Some examples of this are obvious. A room with a king-size bed obviously has more value than a room with a twin-size bed, but you can think outside the box and get creative with it. Factors that might add value include things like when a room is pet-friendly, has a jacuzzi instead of a tub, or has an incredible view out the window, or campsites that have RV hookups and are located near the trailhead, things like that. In other words, variable pricing is about making sure all your units are priced appropriately for the value that they provide to the guests. This may involve some thinking outside the box. People love having options to choose from. It helps provide a more selective experience. One new trend in regards to variable pricing is called attribute-based shopping. It allows the customer to choose a number of add-ons or other factors to further curate the product or service they pay for. Each attribute modifies the final cost in some way. This is something that companies are starting to do more and more, and they're marketing around it as well. For example, some airlines now allow you to pay more money for a seat with more legroom. More legroom is an attribute that you can select when buying a seat on the flight. For hospitality, there are plenty of add-ons you can consider. For bed and breakfasts, breakfast is an obvious attribute. Do you want us to serve you breakfast in the morning? Then you have things like packages. For a romantic couples package, add-ons might be things like a bottle of champagne, rose petals, chocolates, maybe a couples massage. Here's an example of variable pricing in action. So both of these suites from the Palace Hotel and Bathhouse feature a king-size bed, large jacuzzi for two, and a complimentary minibar. And they both have all the same amenities. So what's the difference? Why is one priced higher than the other? Can you spot it? It's of course that Suite 5 is on the upper floor with an excellent view, while Suite 4 is on the ground floor. The owners of this property recognize that not all of their rooms are the same, even if they have all the same features and amenities. And this isn't deterring people from booking the more expensive suites either. In fact, the upper floor suites are just as popular, if not more popular than the ground floor rooms. Campgrounds do this all the time as well. So you have a patch of grass with a fire pit, and then you have a 50-amp RV hookup with running water that's by the best hiking trails. Which one has a higher price? Take a guess. As with all forms of revenue management, variable pricing can be something you experiment with. Try taking a critical eye to your property, figure out which units have more value than others, and price them a little differently. Provide pictures and descriptions that show why they have more value, and see if guests are going for it. If not, you can always reverse it, or maybe that's a great way to make the most of busy seasons. If people tend to flock to the cheapest options first and they really want to stay at your property, they'll have to go for the more luxurious options. The second aspect of revenue management we're talking about today is called dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is all about timing and recognizing that there's a higher demand for your availability during certain times of the week or year. Obviously, there's weekends. That's a higher commodity than weekday reservations because most people plan their trips around Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But there's also things like seasonal trends, holidays, large events, and so on. These are calendar dates you can pretty safely predict will have a higher demand than other dates: Labor Day, Valentine's Day, Christmas, and so on. Dynamic pricing is all about market predictions. What are the travel behaviors that you can anticipate in advance and price appropriately for? Things like weekend rates are pretty obvious, but think about holidays as well. What are your busiest seasons? When do you start hitting 100% occupancy in the year? When do things start slowing down? What's the weather going to be like? Are there any major events happening in your area in the future? What kinds of people will be attending that event? Are they coming from afar, far and wide? Or is it mostly local people? By learning everything you can about all of these factors, you can start putting together a forecast of what to expect. And it won't always be right, but that's okay. Historical data is also a major component of this. We'll go over this in greater depth in a few minutes, but here's a general example of the slow and busy seasons that a lot of properties experience. The low season is pretty much the winter months. It's post-holidays, everyone's tired, the weather is cold, up north anyway, college is back in season, and everyone's working. For me, this actually makes it one of my favorite times to travel because there's less crowding. But because the demand is so low, this can be a difficult time for your business, apart from little spikes here and there. The shoulder seasons are between the low and the peak seasons, so it makes sense that the demand also lies somewhere in the middle. This is where you get a lot of trips to see family and friends, and when travelers want to beat the crowds. Then summer is really the peak season for the most part. This is when the bulk of travel occurs and vacations are planned. This is when properties are typically at their busiest. And then things start winding down again into another shoulder season. These seasonal shifts are a map for your pricing strategy. Take a look at your specific property. Does your occupancy data follow this schedule, or does it look a little different? For example, a ski resort's peak season is probably around January. Look for the spikes that you see year to year and see what you can do to make the most of that high demand. No guide or formula is going to be as useful to you as your own occupancy reports year to year. That's the story you're working with. You'll want to improve your revenue strategy to make your peak season work even better for you and get more value out of your slow seasons, and there are different tools for each of those. One of the best ways to make the most of a busy season is to encourage your guests to book longer stays, or rather to show more preference to guests who book longer stays. A property peppered with single night stays might be missing out on profits from a smaller number of longer stays. There are a couple of ways you can do this. The most obvious one is simply to place a minimum nights restriction. Here's a common one. When you book a room on a Friday, you have to book Saturday as well. Or, during especially busy times, you might even have a blanket 2 or 3 night minimum for the entire date range. I mentioned weekend rates. This is obviously a continuation of that. Remember, a room on a Tuesday is a different product than the same room on a Saturday. There's more demand for one than the other, and it should be priced appropriately. Now let's go over the last section of revenue management today, yield management. Yield management is all about adjusting your rates in direct response to supply and demand. We talked about variable pricing, which is a tool you can use to control your supply by dividing your rooms into different price ranges, and dynamic pricing, which lets you make general predictions about demand. So everything is related to supply and demand, but yield management is extremely reliable at reacting to the market to help you make sure you're making the most of your slow and your busy times. Yield management responds directly to demand by adjusting your rates based on occupancy and the day the reservation is made. In other words, if your property is filling up unexpectedly quickly and your dynamic pricing wasn't prepared for it, you can simply increase your rates on a sliding scale based on your occupancy. Basically, with yield management, you charge differently depending on 1, how far in advance the guest makes a reservation, and 2, your occupancy rate at the time of booking. Take a look at the occupancy of the other properties in your area and pay attention as time goes on. If they ever start filling up quickly, you can probably soon expect the same thing with your own property. Here's a relatively simple example of yield management in practice. This property uses a single rule: 15% increase in base room rates across the board whenever occupancy is 50% or higher. In the month of June, almost 8% of this property's revenue came directly from their automated yield management. They made about $160,000 in that month, so that means they made an extra $12,500 from yield management alone. Here's an example of a property that's using more intensive yield management rules to take greater control of their pricing strategy. This property increases its rates for early birds who are booking 2 or more months out, which is kind of interesting, and then the other 4 rules are all relating to occupancy, marking up the base rate of all the rooms depending on how full the property will be at that time. In the month of June, this property made $4,500 off of yield management alone, representing 5% of the revenue. Based on everything we've been talking about, that first rule doesn't make much sense. Why would you increase your rates for people who book a long while in advance? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Well, it actually depends on the traveler behavior in your area. When people come to stay at your property, is it typically a last-minute decision on their part, or have they been planning this trip for months? If it's the latter, then this strategy makes sense. It's not long-term trip planners you have to worry about, because they'll always book far in advance. You're more focused on those spur-of-the-moment people who are looking for a place to stay, and you'd rather they come stay with you rather than with your competitors. Maybe those competitors have the reverse strategy, and they make last-minute bookings more expensive. This makes you the clear winner in that regard. This just goes to show that there's no one-size-fits-all revenue management strategy. It depends on your own unique situation, and it'll take data and experimentation to figure out the most optimal tactics. So we're going to go through this at a fundamental level and expand from there. Everything is essentially centered around supply and demand. In other words, how much product is available and how much do people want it? For our purposes in the hospitality industry, that product is room nights, or campsite days booked, glamping sites, vacation rentals, and things like that. By nature, room nights are a perishable resource. If you don't sell a room night, you won't ever get another chance to sell that room night. The opportunity has passed. This puts the stakes pretty high above most other industries, who might have many opportunities to sell a product. Supply and demand are tied to price. Low supply and low price means high demand. High supply and high price means low demand. Your quantity is your number of available units, and that doesn't change a whole lot unless you're making some renovations or something. So the main lever you have to play with is price. So let's try setting a price. Here we go. Let's see what happens with price at this level. Looks like the demand is higher than the supply. If you price too low, then demand for the product will be very high, and you'll soon run out of supply. In other words, you've left money on the table, because the customers were willing to pay more. You're at 100% occupancy, and you're turning lots of people away. Let's try again. All right, now we're priced too high. The supply is much higher than the demand. For a property, this looks like a lot of empty rooms. This time you're leaving money on the table because your occupancy is too low. Optimizing your pricing to make the most of supply and demand and hitting that sweet spot is called economic equilibrium. This is where you're maximizing revenue by selling the most rooms for the most money. One great example of this is auctions. When an item is put up for auction, you can see supply and demand in real time. The supply for the auctioned item is 1, and you can see the precise demand for the item as people start to make bids. Bidding at the starting bid is typically a fantastic deal. Demand is higher for a cheap item than an expensive item, especially if the supply is so low. But then more bids start coming in, and the price gets higher. The higher the price gets, the more people slow down in their bidding. The demand is going down. Suddenly it's not such a great bargain anymore, and people start scratching their heads and checking their bank accounts. Finally, the item is sold to the highest bidder. In other words, to the person with the highest demand for the auctioned item. Add more supply and more sellers, and this example comes closer to becoming a real market. Economic equilibrium occurs when the product sells at the highest price with the highest quantity of buyers to afford it. Now, obviously, putting room nights up for auction probably wouldn't be a good strategy, but it's a good example to keep in mind when it comes to supply and demand. Unless that last bidder regrets their impulsive purchase, they're happy to have received that item at the price they paid. If it wasn't worth it to them, they wouldn't have made that final bid. Let's take a look at what supply and demand look like over the course of the year, so we can put these concepts into practice. We mentioned this earlier, but now let's see it represented. This is about as basic as it gets. Low, shoulder, peak, shoulder. And you can see that if you repeat this over several years, you get a nice wave pattern, peaking in the summer, then declining into winter, then rising back up during the summer months again. But this is oversimplifying things quite a bit. It also doesn't align with every business. For example, I mentioned ski resorts. They might see a reverse of this, with greater demand in the winter months. But now we're getting a little more specific, a little more accurate. This is what a typical hotel, B&B, or campground might see over the course of a year. Now you can see these little peaks in between seasons. Now here's a property's actual occupancy data from 2021. As you can see, it follows our model pretty closely, though that won't always be the case. So let's take a look and see what we can figure out from here. Looks like they get a little bump in December. That must mean they get a fair amount of business for the holiday season. Better than November anyway. In fact, the data shows that they were practically full from the 25th to the 31st. But the rest of December was pretty slow for them, hence the 49% average. Another spike in February. Looks like Valentine's Day pulling some weight there. Then from March onward, we're in the low season, but steadily rising as the weather gets warmer until we hit June. Now we're in the shoulder season. Well, it's not the busiest it'll get, but we know it's coming. July and August are our major months at the highest peaks, and then we're coming back down to a shoulder, then into low again for the winter. So that's kind of interesting. But what does it mean for revenue management? Well, by looking at your occupancy reports from past years, you can be more informed about when the demand is high. And this allows you to make educated decisions regarding your dynamic pricing and yield management. Let's assume this property isn't using any kind of yield management. What can we do throughout the year to boost our profits? Well, the most obvious place to look is those peak months, July and August. Almost every day in those months was hitting 100% occupancy. That can mean one of two things. Either you set your rates at the exact optimum level with no guests being turned away, or you could be pricing a little more competitively. Odds are it's the second one. So let's put in some yield management here. Maybe 15% rate increase whenever occupancy is above 70%. But we can do more. What's more valuable to your business? Guests who only want to stay for one night each, or guests who want to stay 3 to 4 nights in a row? The latter, of course. But if you get a bunch of those one-night guests booking up your rooms, you'll have to turn away those 3 to 4 night guests. So let's add a minimum night requirement as well. During July and August, guests have to book at least 2 nights in a row for any reservation. Now let's go into those little peaks, because there are hidden trends when you look a little closer. Here's that same property's occupancy showing just their December. For the month's average, they were below 50%. But as you can see, they alternated between slow days and spikes before it all ramped up for the holidays. It should come as no surprise that each of those big spikes lands squarely on a weekend, while the weekdays don't get as much attention. This looks like a great opportunity to try out some different revenue management strategies for next December. At a glance, it looks like those weekend nights are a high demand product. We'll want to study consumer behavior and figure out how much these weekend guests are willing to spend. If they're willing to spend a bit more, then higher weekend rates might be a good option. If we also want to encourage more guests during the weekdays, maybe a weekday discount would be in order as well. Another thing we can try is sliding rates. People love a good deal. So if they see they can get a 15% discount for booking 4 or more nights in a row, that might be enough to push them over the edge. This would also help shore up your weekdays with more reservations. And finally, it looks like the holiday season is booming for this property. From the 19th to the 31st, they're at least 80% occupied. If that's a consistent trend year over year, it might be a good idea to increase rates for that time period. Or you can ramp up your yield management in December by a bit. The thing with experiments like these is they might not work as intended. Maybe you offer a big discount for weekday reservations, but you still got the same number of bookings as last year. That means you just lost out on profits for no reason. That either means you need to market your discounting better to get more reservations, or maybe the discount just isn't doing you any favors. Or let's say you increase your weekend rates by too much, and your occupancy rate goes down a bunch, losing you revenue in the long run. It's all a numbers game. We also see that spike in February. You could probably guess that's primarily coming from Valentine's Day, and we'd see a similar trend within that month. Even the month with the lowest occupancy still has a spike though. Over in November, we've got Thanksgiving and Veterans Day, and they saw significantly more business during those times. So even when it looks like it's a really slow month, there are hidden spikes within that month. We've speculated about some revenue management ideas. Now let's take a look at this property's back office in ResNexus. And we immediately see weekend rates and special rates. Fantastic. And by the looks of these occupancy numbers, they're not scaring away their guests with these higher rates at all. Their July and August were at nearly 100% occupancy. And those weekends are spiking really high. That might be an indicator that they could raise these rates even more. And here we can see this property's minimum nights rules. Some lodgings have a 2-night minimum year-round, but all lodgings have a 3-night minimum during their peak times of the year: Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the summer months. But perhaps the most important thing you can do with your pricing strategy and revenue management is to accurately measure your results. Release your inner scientist and start evaluating how everything is working. Look at your year-over-year data. If you tried changing up your rates this month compared to last year at the same date range, did your revenue improve or not? Occupancy summary is a great report to look at. This can help you identify when you start entering the busy seasons and when it starts dropping off. Another great report is advanced room revenue. This allows you to view your revenue from yield management. This can help you inform you about how much weight your yield management rules are having on your profits. Though to get the full picture, you'll probably also want to look at your occupancy and RevPAR data. The year-over-year comparison is a direct way to look at your performance compared to the previous year. If you're experimenting with different revenue management strategies, this report can help you see how much of an impact it's having. The PACE report is similar, but it tells you how you're performing as of the current date based on the same date from the previous year, so you can tell if you're keeping pace with last year, shooting ahead, or falling behind. Here's a valuable exercise. Determine how much it costs your business to host a guest for one night. And we're not talking about property expenses you would already have to pay, regardless of whether there's a guest staying in that room, just the price difference between hosting a guest and not hosting a guest. If you're a bed and breakfast, that's water and soap to wash the bedding, cost of ingredients for breakfast, and the effort and money that goes into labor to make it all happen. You could also factor in energy costs and that kind of thing. That's pretty much it. So if you think about it, as long as you're making more than that total, you've made money on that room night. Now, obviously, making the bare minimum isn't exactly a success story, because you have a premium product with decor and storytelling and hospitality and service and quality. Obviously, you shouldn't give away your rooms for pocket change. But from a purely mathematical standpoint, it's good to keep in mind. Given a choice between no occupancy and no revenue at the price you're looking for, and some revenue at a cheaper price, it may be better to have some business than no business. In other words, you need to make it worth your while. This is your minimum threshold to make money on a room night. Don't go under it. Alright, so we're going to go into some more in-depth examples from this point on. So let's define some terminology to make sure we're all on the same page. You're all probably familiar with this already, but here's a little refresher, so please bear with me. So this one's very basic. Occupancy is your number of occupied rooms divided by your total number of available rooms. So for a single day, it's simple. If you have 10 rooms and 7 of them are occupied, your occupancy rate is 70%. Say you want to look at occupancy in the month of May. You have 10 rooms, but one of them was down for repairs for the month. In this case, you would only count the rooms that people can actually book. So that's 9 rooms times 31 days in the month of May, meaning your total number of room nights is 279. Let's say you rented out a total number of 200 room nights across the entire month. So to calculate your occupancy for May, simply take your sold room nights, 200, and divide it by the total number of available room nights, 279. A quick calculator punch tells us that the occupancy of this property for May is 71.7%. Not bad. Occupancy is a useful metric for gauging how busy your business was during a period of time, but it's not necessarily a good indicator of how well your business is performing in terms of revenue. Imagine if you were selling every room night for a nickel. Even if you're at 100% occupancy, that's not very impressive. ADR is used to figure out how much you're making on average for every sold room night. This metric is really only useful if you have different room rates. If all your units are $100 each, then your ADR is always going to be $100. But if you have a variety of rates depending on amenities, the reservation dates, how far in advance the booking was made, and so on, then ADR can help give you an idea of how much you're actually making from each sold room night. ADR is basically useful for measuring how much people are willing to spend at your property, and how much you can expect to make on average per room night sold. But it doesn't really account for your property's overall performance. Imagine you have 20 rooms, and you only sell one night. Your ADR is going to show you how much that one person paid for their room, but it won't account for the fact that 19 room nights went unsold. For that, you'll need RevPAR. There are 2 ways to calculate your RevPAR, and they equate to the same thing. You can either take your ADR and multiply it by the percentage occupancy rate, or simply divide your total revenue by the total number of room nights. Either way, you get a result that tells you how efficiently you're using your rooms or units. This is widely considered to be the best indicator of a property's performance because of this fact. If you have 20 rooms and you sell 15 room nights on a particular day, RevPAR will average out the revenue across all 20 rooms. Selling 15 room nights for this property is significantly better than selling only 15 room nights in a 1,000 room hotel. It's because of this that RevPAR is a great way to compare different competing properties. If you have market data on how other similar businesses are performing in your area, a higher RevPAR basically means better performance. If you do the math and figure out that your RevPAR is close to the upkeep costs, maintenance, utilities, staffing, and so on, for just one room, that's a bad sign. You either need to get more rooms filled or increase your room rates or both. Now, RevPAR is still the most popular and prevalent indicator of a property's success, but here we get a little more nuanced. TrevPAR stands for total revenue per available room. This accounts for sources of revenue besides just room nights, and includes things like room service, the on-site bar or restaurant, gift shops, paid experiences at the property, and things like that. This helps solve the apples to oranges problem you get comparing a property with lots of revenue sources and one that just sells rooms. Don't neglect things you sell beyond rooms. Firewood, romance packages, B&B breakfasts, gift shop items, and so on. Just because they're not tied up in room revenue doesn't mean they shouldn't be considered when measuring your property's performance. With that in mind, let's take a look at our last term for today, GOPAR. Gross operating profit per available room. All right, now we're as complicated as we're going to get. GOPAR accounts for occupancy, number of rooms, room revenue, ancillary revenue, and operating expenses. Because revenue isn't a one-to-one ratio to overall profits. There are maintenance expenses for rooms, food and beverage costs, commissions, marketing costs, things like that. If you have an advertising budget for your property, GOPAR will account for that. We're not going to go super in-depth on this, as RevPAR is a good enough metric for the purposes of this webinar, but it couldn't hurt to crunch some numbers and figure out how much you're actually for real making from each room. Now, let's put everything we've looked at into practice with a couple of examples. We'll be using fictitious properties, but we'll be using real math, so it should be a good illustration of what we're talking about. So we're going to look at 3 properties: Lilypad Lodging, Rosebush Inn, and Cherry Blossom Hotel. They all operate in the same town, and they also each have 10 rooms, just to keep things simple. So let's get to know them a little better. The managers at Lilypad Lodging use flat rate pricing. Every room is $100, no matter the time of year, date of booking, number of nights booked, etc. In other words, they don't really have a pricing strategy. The bright side is that they always know their pricing at any given moment. The managers at Rosebush Inn do things a little differently. They also have 10 rooms, but they are divided into 3 categories. The 2 luxury suites are $150 each. The good view rooms are the other 4 rooms on the upper floor at $120 each. And the remaining 4 rooms are $100 on the ground floor. Rosebush Inn's yield management rules are seasonal, but let's assume our example takes place in August. This is a busy time for them, and they've noticed that a lot of people tend to book way in advance in order to make sure they have room for a big festival that happens every year. So Rosebush decided to actually increase their rates for early bird bookers. They've recognized that a guaranteed room from several months out is actually a pretty high value product, and they don't get too many last minute guests. If their occupancy is filling up, they want to make sure that the last few rooms make enough money to be worth being 100% busy. So they also have a few rules to increase their rates based on occupancy. So when a guest makes a reservation more than 30 days in advance, the room rates increase by 25%. When occupancy is between 60 and 70%, the rates increase by 10%. When occupancy is higher than 70%, the rates instead increase by 25%. Each room has a higher rate when booked for a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, $20 more. The managers at Rosebush Inn also recognize the importance of their luxury suites. They'd rather not have them be peppered with one-night stays across the calendar because they want to keep availability open for guests who want longer stays. So there's a 2-night minimum rule to put in place just for those rooms. And finally, to encourage more of those longer bookings, they have a sliding rate, a 10% discount for reservations 4 nights or longer. That's enough of a discount that it might push some people over the edge and make them book 4 nights instead of just 3. Now finally, our third property, Cherry Blossom Hotel. These managers use revenue management, but they do so very aggressively. Their base rates are much higher than the other 2 properties. Their yield management rules are more extreme. They have a universal 3-night minimum and no sliding rates. So let's take a look at these 3 properties for a busy week in August. A big local festival is taking place on the weekend, and people have been booking far in advance to make sure they have a place to stay in town. So Lilypad Lodging did quite well in terms of occupancy. All 10 rooms were filled for most days of the week. When taking phone reservations, the manager could confidently and happily say that every room was $100. Revenue was at $6,800, not bad. Busy week for them. ADR is just the average daily rate, but the rates are always $100, so there's no surprises here. Remember that RevPAR is revenue per available room. In other words, each of their 10 rooms is making $97 on average for this property per night. Now let's see how Rosebush Inn did. Occupancy is quite a bit lower. They were sold out during the weekend, but their other days weren't quite as busy. but their revenue is much higher than LilyPad's. This is where we can immediately see where occupancy falls short as a metric. It's good for tracking trends, but doesn't tell us how property performed. Rosebush was able to make a lot more in profits for a lot less work. Isn't that just a dream? Average daily rate is $135. This metric is higher because 1, their better rooms are priced higher, 2, they have some yield management rules in place to take advantage of the high demand, and 3, their weekend rates are higher than weekdays for the same reason. RevPAR is one of the best ways to compare property performances. Each room for Rosebush is really pulling its weight. Now let's see how the Cherry Blossom Hotel did this week. Oof, occupancy is way low. Their 3-night minimum and high rates really scared off a lot of guests. LilyPad was the cheapest alternative, but they filled up really quick. So these guests that didn't want to pay high prices for Cherry Blossom went instead to Rosebush Inn. Now the revenue isn't great either. Decent for the amount of business they had, but it wasn't a lot. ADR is of course very high because they were so aggressive with their pricing strategy. But now we'll see where ADR falls short as a metric as we look at RevPAR. Only $34. That's pretty terrible, especially for what was supposed to be a busy time of year for them. It seems Cherry Blossom overestimated how much people were willing to spend. So by studying these results, we can probably make some educated guesses about what each property could be doing better. LilyPad could be making a lot more money for a lot less work if they recognize the value of their high demand product for this time of year. Rosebush's occupancy was pretty steady at first, and then they hit maximum over the weekend. They might be able to get more people in beds if they offered some weekday discounts or something, but it's all about making the busy times worth the effort. This number isn't bad. Plus, their RevPAR is the highest of all three, so that indicates they're performing the best. Cherry Blossom understands revenue management in principle, but they've overestimated how high they can raise their rates. They didn't even hit most of their occupancy-based yield management rules because their occupancy was never high enough to begin with. Rather than trying everything at once, they probably should have made stair-step incremental changes and relied more on their historical data to make predictions about demand. In other words, they went overboard. Their 3-night minimum did guarantee that each guest would provide a good chunk of revenue, but very few people were willing to go for it. Alright, we're coming to the conclusion of our webinar. For our Q&A section of our presentation, I'd like to introduce David Mayfield, Vice President of Business Development at ResNexus. He's been serving the hospitality industry for over 12 years and personally worked with over 1,500 properties. Thanks so much for coming on, David.
Yes, thanks for having me, Gavin. What a great presentation. And a lot of good information there. I have some thoughts I want to share as well. And make sure to go ahead and put in your questions, folks. I want to thank everyone for being here. I do see that we do have one question to start off with from Rob. Well, Rob, it looks like what you're doing is you're using the OTAs like Priceline, Booking.com, and Expedia. The yield management price will be pushed out. So if you did have a room that's selling for $100 on your website, in your reservation system, you want to push out that yielded rate as well. And our system is set up to do that for you. We also have other tools. One that came to mind that you can use in crunching your data is the wait list feature that we have. And it's very visual. With using wait list, you can see how many guests you have that want a future date, that want to book your holidays and things like that. So you can really see if you've got these people on the wait list, that obviously means that you're 100% occupied or 100% occupied in a classification, whether it be a premium site or a premium room. That way you can make those adjustments. Now, in the 12 years that I've been doing this, I've worked with a lot of revenue managers. These are folks that they professionally watch that every single day. Most of my properties are, individually owned, and so we're working with a lot of folks that are nervous. They're about raising their rates or actually going to that fair price. So many times I run into properties that you're really emotionally attached to your rates, or that you just know your rates like the back of your hand. And so what we want to do is make sure that you've gone through the data, can see what that fair price is. A lot of my properties, they take all of their profit or almost all of their profit, and they put it right back in to their business. They put it right back into everything they've got. They're always improving. But when's the last time you gave yourself a raise? And that's what yield management can do. Or it can give you an advantage for when you do need the funds to make certain adjustments to your property. Or if you needed to fix something on your property, make sure you have that as well. Let me see, we've got a few more questions. Dana, if you're a brand new property just built, opening soon, and based on competition, how do you determine initial pricing variables, i.e. 50 to 70%, occupancy 15%? So that's a great question, Dana. What you're looking at there is a lot of different features with revenue management. Definitely look back at what the customer's rates are, your competitor rates are. You don't have any history yet, but that's okay. Look at your amenities or your value adds compared to your competition, and you'll quickly see where your rate should be. You can also use yield management in reverse, where if you're at 0% to 30% occupied, you could actually give a discount ahead of time. You want to make sure that you're putting that on the website, that you do have that early bird discount. Once you hit that threshold of 30%, then you're going back up to your rack rate as well. Let's see, we've got another question from Rob. So booking.com gives a 20% discount for Genius members. Yes, I'm definitely aware of that. So if you're using a sliding rate, what goes then to, if they're getting another discount? I don't know if I quite understand the question, Rob, but yes, if you are giving the discounts to booking.com, it could take away from that yield management. So if you're increasing your rate by 20% once you're 90% occupied, and you're already giving a discount from booking.com, then you're going to be at a neutral gain there, back to your rack rate, for example. Be very careful doing aggressive discounting on booking.com or any OTA. 20% sounds very aggressive. I probably want to talk to you in person about this, and here's my email address so we could set something up as well. And I'd love to talk to anybody about revenue management or yield management and these techniques, by the way. I love coaching. I really feel like mostly what we're doing is consulting our customers and any future potential customer that's out there. Or even if you're not using ResNexus now, I'd love to talk to you about that as well. Rob, what ends up happening, unfortunately, when you're giving a lot of discounts to the OTAs, is we're teaching folks to go to booking.com to find the best rate. And the idea behind yield management in your rate structure should always be that the website's the best deal. That you're doing that. If you go to any resort out there, most of them will say best rate guaranteed on their own website. That's the whole discounting, dynamic pricing discussion there. All right, let's see. Ryan, thanks for the question. Is there a particular time you should set the rates for the entire year? Whatever your off season is, that's always a great time to have time to sit down and look at those rates and plan out the future for that year. I also do recommend you set up a day or put it in your calendar. If you take Mondays off or if Tuesday is a slower day for your property, maybe you set it up where every week you're going in and just making sure, double checking it, eyeballing it. The idea behind yield management is that you're automating that. And if you're automating those features, then hopefully you're doing less work. Also, if you automate it, that's so important because the last thing you want to do is get caught unaware. It reminds me of a property I had up in New York. And they actually have two properties now, maybe because of the yield management, they were able to purchase another property. But they were busy. They were in the middle of their season. They didn't realize that there was a concert coming up. I think it was something like Garth Brooks or the Dave Matthews Band, and they were really caught unaware that had been released, and everything in the area was completely booked out. They were booked up very quickly. They weren't using yield management. Had a great discussion with the owner later about how we needed to make sure that we use yield management in this situation, because they were finding out from the guests that did stay that they were one of the cheapest things in town. And she's not. She's got a very valuable, very nice property, much better than some of the other accommodations in the area, and her rate was much lower, and therefore, obviously she lost out on some revenue, and she was leaving that profit on the table. Last thing you want to do is have you guys leave that profit there. So good question. Thank you, Ryan. Jason's got a question. Is there any work being done to improve the user interface for setting rates? Yes, we are always working on improvements. I'm excited to let you know that is in the works. Also, you do have the ability on the new calendar where you can grab the dates and then just go ahead and change them real quickly as well. So if you want to do some type of manual yield management, you can do that. This might be something that we just need to have a training session, talk to your red carpet professional, Jason, and maybe go through how to change some rates or set up some rate types as well. So you'll be able to change your rates very quickly and easily. So let me know if you guys have any other questions. Again, working in the industry for 12 years, I'd be happy to help out anybody that's got any questions. Just shoot me an email if you would like to set up a time to talk about yield management, discounting, dynamic pricing, and go over some of your reports and see where you should be. Another nice report, I'll just reiterate some of what Gavin went over, is that PACE report. Fantastic report showing you your projections. That report really lets you know where you're heading for the year. Just make sure that you're not underselling your property. Dana was talking about how she's a new property, brand new property being built. And what I've experienced over the 12 years is a lot of properties that change hands. You've got someone that's been running their business for 6, 10, 15 years, and they have felt like their rate was a fair price. New owner comes in and starts using yield management techniques, and with that, using these techniques and talking to their red carpet professional, this new property owner comes in and really, I've seen revenues go up by 5 times sometimes, depending on the property and what the previous person was doing. There's a combination of things, obviously, other factors that go into that. Do you have a new website? Do you have outstanding photos? Obviously, you want to fine tune every part of your business to make sure that yield management is as effective as possible. Jason, thank you. Yeah, we do love that PACE report. It's fantastic. A lot of our properties we're seeing 34% increase over the year before. Just some really exciting stuff that's going on in the industry. So many good tools to help you guys make sure that you're getting the most profit that you possibly can, and also putting out the best product for your customers and helping them out. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to open the door to talk to your red carpet professional if you're already a customer. If you're not, feel free to email me, give me a call. We can set up a time to talk about yield management, go over some techniques, see if it's the right fit for you. There's a lot of different strategies that you can do. If you are new to it, you can set something up like Gavin said, where you're doing more of a stair step and not doing something too aggressive. But can you imagine if your rate could go up by 10%, 5%, and what that can mean to you over the year if 20% or 40% of your reservations were up by just 5%. We're going on the conservative side of things. Well, again, thank you, everybody. I hope you all have a great day. Look forward to talking to you if you do have some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and thanks everyone for being here. This has been awesome. Really great webinar, really great questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.